My name is Clarence Whitmore, and I am 74 years old, a widower who has lived alone for the better part of the last decade in the same house where my late wife and I once raised our daughter, celebrated birthdays, painted the porch together during long summers, and watched the first snowfall of every winter from the warmth of our kitchen window. And yet these days, the place feels less like a home and more like a museum, where the exhibits are my own fading memories, all arranged neatly, but without anyone left to see them. Every morning I wake to the sound of the old wall clock ticking in the hallway, and I go through the same routine that has kept me tethered to a sense of order. I make coffee the way Margaret used to like it, strong and bitter, though I no longer need to make 2 cups, and then I sit at the dining table with the newspaper that I hardly ever finish, because my mind drifts into places where paper and ink cannot follow, places where her voice still fills the silence and her hand still rests lightly on mine. Life at my age is not the slow decline people imagine. It is more like standing still while the rest of the world races past, while neighbors come and go, while new families move into houses on the street and children ride their bicycles up and down the pavement with the kind of carefree laughter I once thought I would hear from my own grandchildren on weekends, though that dream never lasted long enough to take root. My daughter Ellen has built a world far removed from mine, filled with meetings and mortgages. Her husband with his quick smile that always feels like a mask stretched too tight, and the kind of polite phone calls that are never about me but about what she needs from me, whether it is a check written quietly and without conditions, or the reassurance that I am still able to sign papers she places in front of me with explanations I am too weary to question. I sometimes think of myself as a relic, not because my mind is gone, or because my body has failed me entirely, though my knees ache when I climb stairs and my eyesight blurs when the print is too fine, but because the people closest to me have already put me in that category as if I am a living reminder of something they would rather not look at, a responsibility that weighs on their conscience only when they see me, which is not often. I have been alone for so many years now that loneliness itself has become a companion, one that whispers in the quiet of the evening when the house settles and the wind moves through the trees outside, reminding me that I'll still exist even if no one else seems to notice. I keep Margaret's picture on the mantel, a photograph taken when she was 35, the sunlight catching her hair on a picnic day that still lives in my chest. And I talk to that picture sometimes, not out of madness, but out of need, because speaking to her memory feels closer to a real conversation than the hollow exchanges I have with Ellen when she remembers to call. There was a time when I believed that age would bring me closer to my family, that as they matured, they would come to value the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived through wars, recessions, and the deaths of too many friends to count. But instead, it has brought distance, not measured in miles, but in affection withheld, in visits postponed, in birthdays unacknowledged. I often wonder when exactly Ellen began to see me less as her father and more as a weight she had to carry. I think back to when she was a child and would run to me after school, clutching drawings she had made, and how her small voice would say, "Daddy, put this on the fridge," and I would proudly pin her crooked houses and stick figures where everyone could see them. Now she barely remembers the fridge is still in this house, still humming away in the same kitchen where she once spilled orange juice and cried until I picked her up and told her accidents happen. Thornton, her husband, has no use for me at all, except when I am convenient, except when my name on a line can open a door for them financially, except when my savings can bridge the gap between the life they can afford and the life they want to pretend they deserve. In truth, I have accepted the erosion of affection in small increments, telling myself that perhaps this is the natural course of life, that children drift away, that I should not expect to be the center of their world, and yet the bitterness seeps in regardless. For it is not the drifting away that wounds me, but the deliberate neglect, the way they avoid me not out of busyness, but out of calculation, as if my presence in their lives has become a threat to the illusion of independence they parade before their friends. I know I should not care, but I do, because a man who has given his life to his family cannot help but feel the sting when that family erases him as though he were a ledger to be closed. So I sit in this house with its quiet rooms and faded wallpaper, and I carry on with my small rituals that keep me sane. I read the paper, though I already know the world is worse off than it was yesterday. I water the plants, even though half of them lean toward death no matter how much care I give them. I take slow walks to the corner store and back, greeting neighbors who know me only as the old man with the cane. And I wait for phone calls that rarely come. This is not living in the full sense of the word. It is more like existing on the edge of other people's lives, tolerated but not needed, remembered only when money is involved. And yet, for all the disappointment and silence, I still hold on to some foolish thread of hope, as though tomorrow might bring a visit, a smile, an embrace that feels genuine rather than obligatory. And perhaps that is what keeps me breathing at all, that faint possibility that the people who once left drawings on the fridge and laughter in these halls might still remember that I am not just an old man in a house, but the father who carried them on his shoulders, who sacrificed quietly, who endured so they could live easier lives. I tell myself every night as I turn off the lamp beside my bed that tomorrow could be different, though the evidence of years tells me otherwise. This, then, is my life at 74. A man with a beating heart but no one to hear it. A man with stories but no one to listen. A man waiting at the margins of his own family, still clinging to dignity even as the world around him insists on stripping it away. It was late in the spring, one of those days when the sky threatened rain from morning until evening without ever committing to it, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. When the phone rang, and to my surprise, it was Ellen's voice on the other end, not clipped or impatient as it usually was, but unusually warm, the kind of tone she used to employ when she was a girl, asking for something she wanted but feared she might be denied. And immediately I knew there had to be a reason. For my daughter does not call simply to hear how her father is doing. She told me that she and Thornton were planning a family dinner, something they hadn't done in years, and she wanted me to come along, to dress nicely, she said, because they had chosen a place that was a little fancy, but nothing I couldn't handle. I remember sitting there with the receiver pressed to my ear, stunned by the suddenness of it all, and a part of me, that wounded part that still longed for closeness, wanted to believe this was a genuine attempt at reconnection, a chance for us to sit around a table not as adversaries divided by money and silence, but as family. And so I said yes, I would come. Of course, I would come. That entire day, I moved about the house with a kind of restless anticipation. I had not felt in years as if I were preparing for a holiday, ironing a shirt that had not been worn since Margaret's funeral, polishing the shoes that usually sat, gathering dust in the back of the closet, rehearsing in my mind the kind of casual things I might say to make conversation light and pleasant. Yet there was also a flicker of doubt that would not leave me alone, the memory of other times when gestures of kindness had hidden barbs beneath them, when an invitation to visit had ended with a request for money, when a supposed celebration had been little more than a performance staged to create an image for others. I told myself not to be paranoid, not to let suspicion sour the evening before it had even begun. But the truth is that age makes you cautious, especially when the people who should protect you have more than once left you exposed. Thornton's car pulled into my driveway just after 6, the kind of shiny black vehicle that speaks less of necessity and more of pride. And when I opened the door to greet them, Ellen looked me up and down with a smile that seemed genuine enough, though her eyes carried that restless, calculating glint I had learned to recognize, the one that made me feel less like a father and more like a piece of property to be assessed. "You look good, Dad," she said, adjusting the collar of my coat as if she were preparing a child for school rather than a man who had walked through 7 decades of life. And Thornton gave me a nod without much warmth before steering us toward the restaurant. The ride itself was quiet at first, with Ellen tapping away at her phone, and me trying to fill the silence with questions about the grandchildren. Questions that were answered with curt sentences that left no room for follow-up. And soon I gave up, turning my gaze to the window where the gray sky pressed down on the town like a heavy hand. We reached the restaurant just as the first drops of rain began to fall. A place with tall glass windows and a polished wooden sign that seemed to glow in the dim light. And for a moment I felt a small thrill, thinking perhaps this really was an occasion. Perhaps my daughter had remembered that I was still here and wanted me to be part of her life. Inside, the tables gleamed beneath low-hanging lamps, and the smell of roasted meat and wine filled the air, reminding me of celebrations long past. And yet as soon as we were seated, I felt the balance shift. For Ellen began ordering on my behalf, telling the waiter what I should eat, what I should avoid, as though I had forgotten not only my preferences, but the ability to decide at all. And Thornton chuckled when she explained that I was better off with fish than steak, adding something about my stomach that was not true. I laughed along weakly, unwilling to spoil the mood, but inside a familiar unease stirred. The meal itself passed in an odd blur, with their conversation circling around topics that excluded me. Plans for property investments, colleagues I had never met, vacations that I had not been invited to. And I sat there nodding, trying to find an opening, but each attempt fell flat, smothered by their polite indifference. When the plates were cleared and the rain outside had turned from drizzle to steady sheets against the windows, Thornton leaned toward Ellen and whispered something I could not catch, and she nodded, her expression tightening in a way that told me the evening was not about reconciliation at all, but something else, something concealed. On the way home, they insisted we take a different route, claiming the main road was too crowded, though the rain had thinned traffic to almost nothing. And after several turns, we found ourselves on a deserted stretch near the edge of town, where the streetlights were few, and the sound of the rain on the roof of the car grew louder, more insistent. Thornton pulled to the side, and Ellen turned in her seat with a smile that seemed oddly forced. "Dad," she said, "we just need to check something real quick. Can you wait here a moment?" I asked what it was, and she waved her hand vaguely, something about Thornton forgetting to lock the office, something about needing to make a call. And before I could protest, they were out of the car, standing together in the rain for a moment, whispering, then climbing back in, only for Thornton to drive a short distance further before stopping again. "Just wait here, Dad," Ellen said softly, opening my door as if guiding me out. "We'll be back in a few minutes, don't worry. Just stay by the side. It's safer this way." I stepped out, bewildered, the rain immediately soaking through my coat, and, before I could gather my words, the door slammed, the engine roared, and their taillights receded into the distance, until they disappeared entirely, leaving me standing alone in the downpour on a street I did not recognize. For a moment I was too stunned to move, the cold water running down my face, indistinguishable from the heat that pressed behind my eyes. And then the truth settled with the weight of a stone. They had left me, deliberately, calculatingly, as though I were baggage too heavy to carry a moment longer. The rain fell harder, drumming on the asphalt, seeping into my shoes, and I felt the humiliation rise in me sharper than the cold itself. For I was not just abandoned, I was discarded, stripped of dignity, and left like refuse by the roadside. Cars passed occasionally in the distance, their headlights cutting brief arcs through the curtain of rain. And more than once, I thought of stepping into the light and waving. But each time my pride held me back, for I could not bear the idea of strangers seeing me like this. A soaked old man whose own family had decided he was no longer worth the trouble. Instead, I stood there, shivering, every minute stretching longer than the last. The sound of the rain echoing the years of silence and neglect that had led to this one brutal moment. And yet, even as I trembled, even as the ache in my bones deepened and the shame burned hotter than the chill, something inside me hardened, a realization that what they had done could not simply be endured and forgotten, that leaving me in the rain was not just cruelty, but a declaration, and that declaration demanded an answer. It was in that storm, alone on that deserted road, that the first flicker of something new took hold within me, a resolve that I did not yet fully understand, but that I knew would grow. For if they thought I was nothing more than an old man to be set aside, the storm, then they were about to learn that even the frailest figure left in the storm can still become the storm itself. I do not know how long I stood there on that desolate stretch of road, the rain falling with merciless persistence, soaking me to the marrow, until my fingers were so stiff I could barely clench them and my shoes squelched with every step I tried to take. But time in such a moment loses its usual measures. It stretches and contracts in cruel ways, making you feel as though you have been condemned to a purgatory of water and darkness, abandoned not just by your family, but by the world itself. Eventually, when the thought of standing still any longer felt unbearable, I began to walk, not knowing in which direction to go, guided only by the faint glow of distant headlights and the instinct to move forward, because to remain where I was seemed to confirm everything Ellen and Thornton wanted me to be. Helpless, forgotten, irrelevant, my legs trembled under the weight of each step. My knees ached with the kind of pain that comes from age and cold, and yet the humiliation burned hotter than the chill, fueling me with an anger that I had not allowed myself to feel in years. Anger at them, yes, but also at myself for continuing to hope, for still carrying inside me the foolish belief that blood ties could outweigh greed and indifference. It was a stranger, not my daughter, not my son-in-law, who finally pulled over and rolled down his window, his face a mixture of suspicion and pity, as he asked if I needed help. The man looked at me as though I were a vagrant, and when I tried to explain, my words tangled with the rain and the shiver in my jaw. He must have thought me drunk or confused, for he hesitated before reluctantly telling me to climb in. The warmth of the car was almost unbearable after the cold, and as the heater blasted, the steam rose from my wet clothes, filling the small space with a damp odor of old wool and shame. He dropped me near the center of town, not far from my house, and as I thanked him, I caught the look in his eyes, a look that told me he would remember me not as a man abandoned by those who should have loved him, but as a bedraggled old figure, stumbling out of the rain, a nuisance to be pitied and forgotten. By the time I reached my home, every joint in my body screamed with pain, and I collapsed into a chair in the living room, unable to remove my soaked clothes, simply staring at the carpet where water pooled beneath my shoes. For hours I sat there, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the questions gnawed at me, questions that had no answers, at least none that could soothe me. What kind of daughter leaves her father in a storm? What kind of man encourages his wife to discard the very person who had once cradled her in his arms? What had I done to deserve this final rejection? Yet underneath the pain, underneath the humiliation, there was something else, something new, a rising current of clarity that told me this was no accident, that their cruelty was not spontaneous but deliberate, and that behind their actions there had to be a plan. The next morning, after a night without sleep, I forced myself to the desk, where my checkbook and old financial records lay scattered. Remnants of years when Margaret and I had kept everything carefully accounted for, and I began to review, line by line, the recent transactions that Ellen had coaxed out of me, the checks written under the guise of helping with tuition, or fixing the roof, or paying down medical bills that were never hers to begin with. And then, staring at the most recent withdrawal, I realized that while I had been standing in the rain, abandoned and shivering, Ellen had been attempting to access my account, to transfer money that was not hers, as though leaving me there had been nothing more than a distraction, a way to buy themselves time. The realization struck with such force that I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself, for suddenly the picture began to form, the scattered hints of her tone on the phone, the forced smiles, the way Thornton always seemed to hover whenever she brought papers for me to sign. This was not neglect, it was strategy, and I was the obstacle in their path. Still, I tried to find excuses in my mind, tried to convince myself that maybe I had misunderstood, that perhaps desperation had led them to foolishness, that maybe they would come back and apologize, drenched in guilt and regret. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. The truth was that the pattern had been clear for years. The gradual withdrawal of affection, the calculated visits, the growing insistence that I could not manage my own affairs, the subtle corrections when I misremembered small details, all pieces of a narrative they were weaving, one where I was not a father, but a fragile old man slipping into confusion, a narrative that could justify what they were already doing behind closed doors. I remembered suddenly the last time Ellen had visited me at the house before this dinner, how she had lingered at the kitchen counter with papers she wanted me to sign, claiming it was just a routine insurance update, and how Thornton had sat there with that tight smile, watching my pen as though the ink itself were gold. At the time I had dismissed the unease, told myself not to be paranoid, but now it returned with brutal clarity, and I realized that every signature I had given was another stone in the wall they were building to enclose me, to render me powerless. That afternoon, as I changed out of my damp clothes and brewed myself a cup of coffee, with hands that still trembled, the shame deepened into fury, not the kind of wild anger that blinds, but a slow, deliberate flame that began to warm the cold corners of my mind. I knew then that what had happened on that rain-soaked road was not just an act of cruelty, but a test, a rehearsal for something larger, a way of seeing whether I would accept humiliation without protest. They had left me outside in the storm to see if I would crawl home in silence, and in doing so, they had revealed the depth of their intentions, and once seen, I could not unsee it. The first escalation, then, was not in their cruelty, but in me, in the shift that occurred when I decided that I would no longer be silent, that I would not play the role of the helpless old man they had cast for me. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, a notebook open before me, and I began to write everything down, every check, every visit, every cruel remark, and every paper I had signed. Not because I needed the record, but because I needed to remind myself that I was not losing my mind, that my memory was still sharp, that the narrative they were spinning was false. And as I wrote, the storm outside quieted, the rain finally easing into silence, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost holy that while they believed they had left me broken, what they had really done was awaken something that had been dormant for too long, the will to fight, to reclaim not only my dignity, but the truth of who I was. Several days passed in a haze of exhaustion and restless thought. The kind of days when the hours blur together and you can scarcely recall whether you have eaten or slept. And though my body demanded rest, my mind would not release me, circling the same questions, returning again and again to the image of those retreating taillights vanishing into the rain, until the humiliation no longer felt like an isolated event, but rather the final stitch in a garment that had been sewn around me for years. I decided I could not keep living in uncertainty, and so I began to search my house not out of paranoia, but out of a desperate need to know the truth. Rifling through drawers where Ellen had once placed documents for me to sign, opening boxes in the attic where Margaret and I had kept our records, and in time I found what I had dreaded and yet expected all along. A folder tucked beneath others, its edges crisp in a way that told me it had been handled recently, containing photocopies of medical forms, insurance statements, and, to my horror, a report dated only weeks ago, declaring that I was showing early cognitive decline, signed not by any physician I had ever seen, but by a name I did not recognize. I sat at the table staring at that paper until the lines blurred, until I felt the weight of betrayal settle on my chest so heavily that I could scarcely breathe. For this was no misunderstanding, no desperate mistake. They were preparing to strip me of my independence legally, building the case that I was no longer capable of handling my own affairs. And once that was accepted, my savings, my house, every last trace of autonomy would be theirs to command. What sickened me even more was the detail that accompanied the forged statement, a page attached with what was meant to look like supporting testimony from Margaret, dated years earlier, as if my dead wife had written a note confessing that she had long suspected I would one day lose my mind. A signature crudely imitated, but unmistakably hers in the eyes of anyone who did not know the real hand. To see her name misused in this way, to have her memory dragged into their scheme, hurt me more deeply than the rain or the abandonment ever could, for it proved beyond doubt that there was no limit to what Ellen and Thornton were willing to do. It was in that moment, staring at those forged words, that the stakes of everything became clear, and whatever remnant of softness or hesitation I still harbored died quietly inside me. I understood now that I was not simply an inconvenience to them, but an obstacle, that they were willing to rewrite even my wife's memory to suit their ambition, and that if I did not act, I would soon be erased, not just from their lives, but from the record of my own existence. The midpoint of my story, if such a thing can be named, came not in the storm where they left me shivering, but here, in the silent realization that I was at war with my own flesh and blood, and that the battleground was not only money or property, but the truth of who I was, my sanity, my dignity, my very name. I felt something harden within me, something I had not touched since the years when I was still working, when I carried responsibility with a steady hand and refused to bend under pressure. That night I gathered every suspicious document, every scrap of evidence I could find, and placed them in a locked drawer, not because I intended to hide them from myself, but because I intended to bring them forward at the right time, to place them in the hands of someone who could turn them into the weapon they were meant to be. As I moved through the house in the dim light, the old floorboards creaking under my feet, I no longer saw the rooms as tired remnants of the life I had lost, but as an arsenal of memory and proof, a place where the walls themselves bore witness to my sanity, where every detail of order contradicted the lie they were building. And when I finally lay down in bed, exhausted, the papers still vivid in my mind, I did not feel despair, but a strange, steady calm, as though I had passed through a storm, not of rain, but of revelation, and emerged on the other side, sharper, clearer, ready. For the first time in years, I was no longer waiting for my daughter to come back to me, no longer hoping for reconciliation that would never arrive. I knew now that she and her husband had declared themselves my enemies, and if they had chosen the path of deception and betrayal, then I would meet them there, not with weakness, but with resolve, and I would make them understand that the man they left in the rain was not the man who would face them in the light. I woke the next morning with that counterfeit report still burning behind my eyes, and I realized that anger, for all its heat, would not be enough to carry me through what was coming, that what I needed was method and patience and a willingness to walk into offices that smelled of toner and old carpet and demand that the world look me in the face and acknowledge that I was still here. And so I began with the name at the bottom of the page, the so-called physician whose signature declared me to be slipping away. Dialing the number listed on the letterhead and wading through a mechanical greeting that pushed me from extension to extension, until at last a human voice arrived, a receptionist whose practiced cheer faltered when I explained that I needed to verify a capacity evaluation she supposedly had on file, and after a pause long enough to make me imagine the quiet exchange of glances on the other end, she told me with caution that sounded very much like fear that the doctor had never seen me, that his clinic did not perform capacity evaluations without in-person testing, that the form in my hands did not match any they used, and then abruptly she ended the call, which told me what I needed to know more clearly than any confession could, because there are lies that crumble under sunlight, and this was one of them. I copied every page, sealed the originals, wrote the date on the envelope in the big, careful hand I used when I balanced ledgers for a living, and then I carried my evidence to the bank, where the manager had known me since the days when Margaret and I deposited our first paychecks and dreamed about vacations we never took, and I asked her to print a full record of attempted transfers and address changes for the past 6 months, which she did, with a furrow in her brow that deepened with each page, until she slid the stack back to me and admitted that someone had tried twice in the last week to redirect my statements to a P.O. box across town, and that there had been a flagged attempt to enroll me in online banking from a device not previously associated with my account. And when I asked for the IP address, because even an old man can learn new words when his survival depends on it, she hummed softly and said she could only release it with a request from counsel, which was the moment I understood that I needed a lawyer, not tomorrow or next week, but today. I chose a name I remembered from church bulletins and community fundraisers, a woman known for her steady voice and the patience of someone who has listened to too many people talk themselves into corners, and when I sat across from her at a table that was too modern for a man like me, all beveled glass and hard edges, I told her what had happened without begging for sympathy, because I was finished with begging, and she listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow pad with strokes so neat they seemed to pin my words to the page. And when I finished, she did not make comforting noises. She only asked to see the papers, and as she turned them, her jaw set. And she said we would do 3 things immediately. First, arrange an independent neuropsychological evaluation with a specialist whose reputation was such that even a judge wary of old men insisting they were fine would have to respect it. Second, file a fraud report with the state medical board and the clinic, whose name had been used not because we expected them to fix my life, but because paper trails have a way of laying down tracks for truth to run on. And third, place a hold on certain transactions so that transfers above a modest amount required in-person verification and a secondary signature from me in ink at the branch, which would be inconvenient but would also slam the door on whoever was trying to crawl through my accounts. She asked whether I had told anyone else about the forged note purportedly from Margaret, and when I shook my head, she exhaled slowly, as if someone had handed her a crystal glass and told her it was already cracked, and said that we would keep that piece close until it could speak at the right moment, because some revelations do not belong to police reports. They belong to courtrooms where silence breaks like thunder. That afternoon, as if summoned by the simple act of my standing up for myself, the next blow arrived in the form of a knock at the door that carried the peculiar rhythm of authority rather than neighborliness, and when I opened it, two uniformed officers stood with rain darkening their shoulders and a third person behind them wearing a plastic badge on a lanyard, and the woman with the badge explained in a voice both gentle and rehearsed that Adult Protective Services had received a report expressing concern about my welfare, specifically about self-neglect and confusion, and that they were here for a wellness check, nothing intrusive, just a few questions to ensure I was safe. I invited them in, not because I enjoyed the humiliation of being audited in my own living room, but because I understood that resistance would be taken as evidence against me, and I answered their questions with the calm that comes from years of filing taxes on paper and knowing every digit matters, reciting the date, the names of my medications, the meal I had eaten, the name of the president, the governor, the pastor who had buried Margaret, and finally I led them to the kitchen, where each jar was labeled and every bill was stacked by due date, and I showed them the notebook where I had logged my calls and my findings, and slowly the lines in the caseworker's face softened, and in a small gesture that would mean nothing to a jury, but everything to an old man standing on the edge, she touched my forearm and said that if I needed anything, I should call her directly, because sometimes reports are weaponized by people who want control rather than justice. When they left, I sat in the chair by the window and watched their car idle at the curb while the caseworker tapped notes into her tablet. And I knew Ellen had not expected me to meet this probe with order and clarity, that she had assumed the very presence of officials in my home would rattle me into proving her point, and I steadied myself with the thought that every attempt to bury me might yet turn into a shovel full of dirt they would have to lift themselves. That evening my phone lit with a number I did not recognize, and I answered, because I am still a man who believes that hidden numbers might carry good news. And a young voice came through, hesitant and bright, my granddaughter's voice, a sound I had not heard in so long that I felt my chest seize. And she said, "Hello, Grandpa," in a tone that nearly unmade me, followed by a stumbling apology for not calling more often, then a story about classes and the cost of books and how hard it had been for her parents lately. And then, as if slipping on ice, she asked whether I could send something small, just until the end of the month, because her mother would be mortified to ask, and she knew money was awkward now, but she missed me and wanted to see me, and I stood there, phone hot against my ear, while an entire life of wanting to be needed surged up in me like a tide, and I nearly said yes out of love, out of reflex, out of the ancient ache to be a hero to someone carrying my blood. I did not say yes. I asked her whether she knew that her mother had filed a report to have me evaluated against my will, whether she knew about the forged doctor's letter and the note bearing her grandmother's name, and the silence that followed was longer than a city block, a silence in which I could hear the fluttering of the little lies that had been fed to her. And finally she whispered that she didn't know anything about that her parents had said I was confused and stubborn, and that everyone was trying to help me. And I told her I believed that she believed it. And I told her that help would be coming to me on terms that did not require my humiliation, and that I would not be sending money today. And her breath hitched, and she said she understood. And after we hung up, I wept without sound, because there are ripples to every sin, and the first to feel them are always the children who did not choose the water they were born into. The next morning a certified letter arrived, fat with exhibits and written in a tone that tried and failed to resemble compassion, informing me that Ellen had petitioned the county court for temporary guardianship over my person and estate, citing evidence of recent confusion and reckless financial behavior, attaching, as if to crown the edifice of lies, a series of photographs taken who knows when and which I appeared either to be searching for my keys at the supermarket or standing without. Purpose at the end of my own driveway, and I laughed aloud then, a dry laugh that tasted like old pennies, because what had once been a private betrayal had now become a public theater, and theaters are where I can place my evidence in the arc of a story a judge will understand. I called my attorney and delivered the envelope to her office, and by afternoon she had drafted a response that was all steel beneath velvet, demanding dismissal of the petition, requesting sanctions for bad faith, and, with a coolness that startled even me, reserving the right to refer the forged medical documents to the district attorney if the other side wished to press their luck. She told me to expect turbulence, that people who rely on manipulation do not go quietly when the curtain is tugged, and she was right, because the very next day my homeowner's insurance called to verify a requested change to my mailing address and coverage level, a change I had not made, and when I pressed the agent for the source of the request, he grew cautious and said the online portal showed a login from an unfamiliar device, and I heard in his voice the same mixture of concern and fear that had crept into the receptionist's voice at the clinic, and I realized how many small systems could be bent by someone persistent and unscrupulous, how many lines of defense had to hold if a person like me is to remain sovereign. There were more blows, each one designed to exhaust me rather than destroy me outright, because exhaustion is the cheapest weapon of all. A notice from the county about property tax delinquency that turned out to be an error triggered by an improperly filed change of address. A locksmith arriving at my door with work order in hand, claiming a family member had authorized rekeying for my safety. A neighbor's text asking if everything was all right, because 2 people had been seen photographing my house in the twilight. A social media post from a mutual acquaintance praising Ellen for stepping up for her dad in a difficult season, which told me that while I was securing the facts, she was securing the narrative. Through each of these, I followed the advice my attorney had given me, which was to treat every contact as a deposition and every document as an exhibit, to be courteous without being gullible, to refuse entry to anyone without a warrant, to call her first and speak second, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn, because there is a gravity to truth that asserts itself when given enough room. It was during this stretch that a memory surfaced with the insistence of a buoy released from the depths, a memory of Thornton regaling guests at a barbecue years ago with talk of a friend who could streamline paperwork, a man who knew how to get forms where they needed to go without the hassle of in-person appointments. And I found his name buried in the old folder of business cards I keep beside the phone, a card so cheaply printed the ink smudged under my thumb, and when I handed it to my Mosa attorney, she smiled without humor and said that people who talk about streamlining paperwork usually mean jumping fences, and within days she produced a small trove. State records showing disciplinary notes on that man's notary commission, OC complaint about an improper witnessing and gold in a mine of clay, a log of a mobile notary visit scheduled to my address 2 weeks before the rain, a visit I had never agreed to, suspected to have been canceled when I failed to be available, which meant they had been laying tracks to secure a power of attorney before the dinner invitation ever arrived. The discovery did not surprise me so much as it steadied me, for it placed their cruelty in a chronology that made sense, revealing intention where before there had been only the shock of their audacity. And in that order I found the fuel to continue, because nothing clarifies a war like a map. Yet even as the evidence mounted, the cost of fighting pressed down, not merely in money, though that too bleeds a man if he is not careful, but in energy, in the daily wear of telling and retelling the story, so that the bureaucracies that serve justice can do their work. And there were nights when I sat in the kitchen with the light off and thought about calling Ellen to say that it was enough, that she could have what she wanted if only she would stop dragging Margaret's memory into this. And every time that thought appeared, I pushed it away with the knowledge that capitulation would not buy peace. It would only deepen their belief that my will was soft clay. And if I yielded now, I would not be a father, finally showing mercy. I would be a man surrendering the last thing that made him himself. On the hardest days, I found a strange strength in routine, in the old methods, in sharpening a pencil and listing tasks in the morning so that I could strike lines through them at night. Because crossing out a task is a small proof of agency, and agency is the first thing a thief of dignity tries to steal. When the date for the first hearing on the guardianship petition was set, my attorney suggested we not only appear, but do so with the kind of coherence that makes conjecture look childish, and she scheduled my evaluation with the specialist for the week before, a session that lasted hours and left me both drained and vindicated. Because there is something humbling about being asked to repeat lists and copy shapes at my age. Yet there is also something triumphant about watching the examiner nod, while noting that my recall, though slowed by time, remained intact, that my judgment was sound, that my orientation was impeccable, and when the report arrived on heavy paper bearing a signature that would withstand any microscope, I placed it beside the forged letter, and felt the difference between fiction and fact, like the difference between wax and stone. We gathered affidavits, from the bank manager about attempted address changes, from the clinic denying the evaluation, from the neighbor who saw the locksmith and called me before the man could start, and from the caseworker who had, in carefully neutral language, found no basis for the alarmist claims in the anonymous report. Each piece alone would be ordinary, but together they formed a shape that could not be ignored, a weather system gathering strength over warm water. On the eve of the hearing, Ellen called at last, her voice soft and threaded with concern, and she asked how I was feeling and whether I had found someone to help me with those complicated papers. And she said that whatever happened tomorrow, she wanted me to know she loved me, and I listened to the practiced tenderness and felt the old ache stir. And I wanted to tell her that love does not file false reports or rob a dead woman of her signature, that love does not leave a man in the rain to test whether the world will absorb him, and instead I said that I would see her in the morning, that there would be time enough for words when the judge had heard ours. And after we hung up, I sat in the quiet and realized I was not afraid, not any more, because fear is the child of uncertainty, and the map in front of me had lines I could follow. I laid out my suit, the one that still smells faintly of cedar from the closet, and I polished my shoes, and I set my notebook on the table with a pen beside it. And as I turned off the light, I thought of Margaret, not as a ghost invoked for comfort, but as a witness to the man I was still trying to be. And I promised her that I would carry our name through the weather they had stirred, that I would not let our history be rewritten in ink that washes away when it gets wet. So the second escalation was not just the barrage of their moves, but the answer I built to each one, the way a storm meets a shoreline, and the shoreline does not flee, but reshapes itself to break the waves. And if they expected a collapse, they found, instead, a wall of ordinary facts stacked carefully like sandbags against a flood. And behind that wall stood a man who had spent too long asking for kindness, and finally understood that dignity is not granted by those who stand to gain from its loss. It is claimed by the one who has been told he is finished and decides, quietly and without fanfare, to go on. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of pale, indecisive sunlight that does not so much illuminate as remind you that darkness is only ever waiting to return. And I dressed slowly, every movement deliberate, as though I were suiting myself not only in fabric but in memory, fastening each button as if to armor myself with the years that had carried me here. And when I stood before the mirror, I did not see a defeated old man, but a figure lined by time and endurance, a man who had survived storms greater than rain and would survive this too. My attorney met me at the courthouse steps, her presence steady, the sound of her shoes striking the stone, a rhythm that seemed to set the pace of my own heart. And as we walked inside, I felt the air grow heavy with the scent of polished wood and stale paper, the atmosphere of a place where truth is not given but contested, where one's very existence must be spoken into being before it is erased by silence. Ellen was already there, dressed in muted tones, her hair perfectly arranged, her eyes darting away from mine the instant they met. And beside her, Thornton stood with the smug confidence of a man who believes that paperwork can outweigh blood. His hands resting on a folder as though it contained the very keys to my undoing. I took my seat and folded my hands in my lap, not trembling, not shivering, simply waiting, because I had learned in these months that the true strength of a man is often revealed not in the force of his words, but in the patience of his silence. When the judge entered and the ritual began, Ellen's attorney rose first, spinning a portrait of me as fragile, confused, incapable of managing even the smallest task, without danger to myself. And though I sat still, I felt each word fall like stones into a pit dug in my name. And when they produced the forged medical statement and the supposed testimony of Margaret, I thought my heart might break, not from fear of the judge's belief, but from the desecration of her memory, the audacity to use her name in that sterile chamber as a tool of manipulation. But then my attorney rose, her voice measured and calm, and one by one she laid the foundation of our defense, not with theatrics, but with facts, each document sliding across the table like a blade polished for its purpose. The bank records showing attempted fraud, the affidavit from the clinic denouncing the false report, the sworn statement of the caseworker who had found no evidence of neglect, the photographs of my kitchen neatly organized, my records carefully kept, the evaluation from the specialist declaring me fully competent. She spoke of patterns, of manipulation, of the quiet ways in which trust can be twisted into leverage. And as she did so, I watched the judge's face change, the set jaw softening the eyes, narrowing not in suspicion of me, but in recognition of the story that was forming before him, the story of a man not failing, but being failed by those closest to him. When at last she handed him the forged note bearing Margaret's name, the silence in the room deepened until I could hear the tick of the clock above the bench, and I felt something shift, a weight moving from my shoulders to theirs, as though for the first time Ellen and Thornton understood that this was no longer a contest of words, but of truth, and truth, once revealed, does not easily return to shadow. Ellen's face crumpled for the briefest moment, a flicker of shame, or perhaps only the shock of being exposed. But Thornton's jaw tightened, and I saw in his eyes not remorse, but calculation, the desperate scramble of a man whose plan has been dragged into daylight. The judge spoke then, his words slow and deliberate, acknowledging the seriousness of the petition and the severity of the evidence presented, but noting that the testimony and documentation provided by my counsel outweighed the allegations, that the petition for guardianship was not only denied, but stricken with prejudice, that costs would be borne by the petitioners, and that the matter of forged medical records was being referred to the district attorney for review. I sat motionless as the words washed over me, my hands still folded, my heart steady, and yet inside me something broke open. A flood, not of triumph, but of release. The release of months of tension, of nights spent in doubt and fear, of the lingering question of whether the world would believe me. And as the gavel fell, I closed my eyes and whispered Margaret's name, not as plea, but as thanks. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, sharper, as though the world itself had been washed clean, though I knew the rain had long since stopped. Ellen brushed past me without a word, her face set in stone, and Thornton followed, his stride quick, his eyes refusing to meet mine. And I let them go without calling after them, because some victories do not require confrontation. They require only, the quiet dignity of endurance. My attorney touched my arm gently and said it was over for now, that there would be more to face perhaps, but that today I had won. And I nodded, though in my heart I knew it was not simply a victory, but a reclamation. The moment when the man they left in the rain rose not as a victim, but as the storm they could not contain. That night I sat once more at my kitchen table, the notebook open before me, the pages filled with the record of what I had endured, and I realized that I no longer needed to write every detail, no longer needed proof for myself, for the truth had already spoken in a place where lies had sought to prevail. Instead, I wrote only one line, steady and firm. They left me outside in the rain, but I was the storm that hit them, and as I set down the pen, I felt not only vindicated, but alive, more alive than I had in years, for I had faced betrayal and humiliation and the slow erosion of dignity. And I had not only survived, I had fought back, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the one thing they had sought to steal, the certainty of who I am. In the days that followed the hearing, I moved through my house with a different kind of awareness, not the anxious vigilance of a man waiting for the next attack, but the steady calm of someone who has walked through fire and discovered that his skin, though marked, still holds, and that knowledge carried me like a current through the ordinary motions of life. I would wake in the morning and sit by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, the same window where I had so often sat in dread, and the light would fall across the table in a way that reminded me that even small rituals can anchor a man when the rest of the world has tried to unmoor him. The phone rang less frequently now. No sudden inquiries from banks or insurance companies, no masked voices asking to verify suspicious transactions, no carefully staged appeals from officials who had been misled by false reports. Silence, once unbearable, became a gift, proof that the tide had turned and that their grip on my life was loosening, perhaps not by choice, but by necessity. Because once truth has been nailed into the record, it is harder to pry loose. Ellen did not come to see me, nor did Thornton, and though part of me ached with the absence, another part felt lighter, freed from the endless cycle of disappointment and false reconciliations. For years I had lived as though bound to them by duty, by the unspoken contract that parents must forgive and children must love. But now I saw those bonds for what they had become, chains forged of expectation and habit, chains I could finally allow to rust away. I no longer sought their apologies, for apologies given under duress are only words meant to buy time, and I no longer sought their company, for company offered out of obligation is lonelier than solitude. What I sought instead was a life shaped by my own hands, even if those hands shook with age, and in that pursuit I found a quiet satisfaction I had not felt in decades. I began to tend again to the small garden in the backyard, the one Margaret had once loved, pulling weeds with slow determination, planting tomatoes though I knew they might not thrive, pruning the roses that had grown wild in the seasons of neglect. Neighbors stopped by, not out of pity, but out of genuine kindness, bringing cuttings from their own yards, chatting over the fence, reminding me that the world beyond blood can still offer family of a different kind. On Sundays, I returned to church, hesitant at first, afraid of the sideways glances that might carry whispers of gossip. But instead, I found people who had heard some version of my story and greeted me not with judgment, but with warmth. Their hands, clasping mine with a firmness that reassured me I was still recognized as myself. Not as the caricature Ellen had tried to paint. There were nights when the loneliness pressed in, when the memory of Margaret's absence and Ellen's betrayal seemed to echo through the house so loudly I could not sleep. And in those hours I would open the drawer where the forged papers were locked away, and I would look at them not to torment myself, but to remind myself of the distance I had traveled, from the man who doubted his own memory to the man who stood in court and spoke his truth. They no longer held power over me. They were relics of a battle I had survived, artifacts of a war that had failed to claim me. Sometimes I would imagine Ellen years from now, remembering not her victory, but her loss, and I would wonder whether regret would come to her, whether she would realize that the inheritance she sought was worthless compared to the inheritance of love she had squandered. I did not wish her suffering, though, not any more. What I wished her was the clarity that had finally come to me, that in seeking to erase me, she had only erased herself from my life, and that in trying to leave me in the rain, she had only awakened the storm that washed her out of the center of my heart. The world moves on, even when families fracture, and I discovered that resilience is not built in grand gestures, but in small choices repeated daily. To cook for oneself instead of skipping meals, to open the blinds instead of sitting in the dark, to call an old friend instead of waiting by the phone for a child who will not call. Each of these choices stitched me back together, thread by thread, until the man I saw in the mirror no longer looked broken but tempered, like steel that has been bent and hammered until it holds a shape stronger than before. I learned that dignity, once reclaimed, does not slip away easily, that once you have spoken your truth in a room where lies sought to bury you, you cannot go back to silence, and you do not need to. So this is my ending, though it does not close like a book snapped shut, but rather unfolds like a horizon, carrying me into days I did not think I would see, days not defined by betrayal, but by the quiet persistence of living. They left me outside in the rain, thinking I would wither, but the storm I became is past now, leaving in its wake not destruction, but renewal, not bitterness, but clarity. And if the world chooses to remember me, I hope it remembers not the man shivering on the roadside, but the man who rose from that place, drenched and humiliated yet unbroken, who found in himself a strength he thought long gone, and who carried that strength into the final chapter of his life, not as a victim but as his own witness, his own defender, his own storm.